All right, well, if you have a Bible, open up to Mark 11 or just pull it up on your phone today as we continue our series through the Gospel of Mark. All year here in 2023, we've been going through this biography of Jesus' life called the Gospel of Mark, and we come in these last few months to 1 week of time, the last week of Jesus' life, when he brings kind of everything to a crescendo and ultimately leading to his death, burial, and resurrection. So last week, we talked about Palm Sunday and Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and today some of the fireworks really start, where a lot of conflict comes that ultimately lead to his death on our behalf. And today he's going to take on the topic of religious hypocrisy in this famous scene of him going into the temple and overturning tables. I wish I could say that religious hypocrisy is a dated concept that we don't have anymore, and we don't have to worry about this because religious leaders are never hypocrites today. But your laughter sort of betrays that you know that's not true. We live in a generation maybe that is a little overly obsessed with the topic of religious leader hypocrisy. It's a frequent topic on stand-up comedy shows and on movies and on TV shows. It's a frequent topic in the news. The issues of religious hypocrisy over whether it's the abuse crisis cover-up, or whether it's issues of profiteering by religious leaders, or using religious language for political one-upmanship. This charge of being a religious hypocrite is quickly on our lips as Americans today. And I wonder what you do with that as a Christian. What do you do with the sort of milieu around us of people saying, oh, so much of religion is hypocrisy? Well, some of us kind of cross our arms and we sort of say, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. And we point out people like Jason, who shared earlier, and say, the guy spent 17 years in places where it's illegal to do what he does for the purpose of helping people know about Jesus. What's hypocritical about that, right? What's profiteering about that? What's anything but selfless about that? But, we know that not everyone's like Jason, and we know our own hearts and our own lives aren't always like that. Others of us just blame shift, and we say, well, yeah, there is religious hypocrisy, and it's over there in that other group, in that other part of the country, or that other denomination, or that other generation. It's not there for us, but it's their problem, right? It's the Pentecostals' problem, it's the Catholics' problem, it's the older generation's problem, it's definitely Florida's problem. Sorry. It's like a Disney World, Disneyland rivalry thing, I guess. I don't know. But we know that's not true fully either. I want to look today with you at Mark 11, where Jesus confronts religious hypocrisy. And in that process, I want you to see the heart of Jesus himself and how he responds to religious hypocrisy so that we can align our hearts with his, because that's always what it means to be a Christian. And then I also want us to spend some time soberly reflecting on our own lives and whether our lives match up any of the very things that he is judging and critical of. And then at the end, I want to hold out some hope of where do we go from here? And what hope do we have as Christians in the light of the religious hypocrisy that marks our day and Jesus' day? So let's jump into it in Mark 11, verse 12. On the following day, that's the day after he entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. This is, for a lot of us when we're reading the Bible on our own, admittedly an odd passage. And we read it and we say, what spiritual value am I supposed to get out of my Bible reading today? Jesus got hangry? I don't know, I get hangry? I'm like Jesus? I don't know. What do I do with this? What am I supposed to take away from this? Well, I want you to notice something as we read the passage as a whole today, and as we go through the sermon together, that we'll have the initial scene about the fig tree here, and then we'll have the cleansing of the temple in the middle that Don read for us a while ago, and then we'll come back to the fig tree at the end. Whenever you're reading the Bible on your own, you see that kind of bracketing. Usually it's a narrative device to say that the reason for the bracketing is seen in the middle. Sometimes this will be called a chiasm. That the meaning that informs the parts, the bracketed parts, comes in the middle. And the meaning for this whole story is about hypocrisy. Essentially what Jesus is living out here is a sort of enacted parable. When he goes to the fig tree, spoiler alert, it's not about the fig tree. It's not about the figs. It's about this idea that he comes to something that looks beautiful from the outside, looks promising from a distance, but when he gets up close, it turns out that there's nothing meaningful or fruitful there to be had. It doesn't take a big stretch for us to see that metaphor in the lives of people we know and maybe in our own lives. That we can sort of seem like we have it together from a distance, that if our spirituality is not inspected closely or our relationship with God is not looked at from a life-on-life perspective, we kind of look like we have it together. But as soon as people get to know us or listen to us or observe our life and start inspecting for fruit, it turns out there's not much there at all. To understand why this metaphor is important is to look at this passage carefully and to understand a little bit of the cultural backgrounds. One is that, a fig tree was a really rich metaphor in the Old Testament to refer to the people of God, to refer to Israel. So when Jesus comes up to a fig tree, he didn't just choose a plant at random. It's a bit like saying, an American went and found a bald eagle, and the bald eagle, it turned out, was sickly and dying. That would have a lot of national significance for us as Americans, even though we realize it's just a bird, but it's sort of a shared metaphor to represent our people. On top of that, to find the fig tree being in leaf in April would have been a sign of vitality for a lot of their people. I'm not going to pretend to be more of a gardener than I am. If you go up to my office, you will find lots of plants that are in various stages of dying, and those are not miracles. I'm just not very good with plants. But in the commentaries, one of the things I read in preparation for this week's sermon described this odd line that Mark has about it was not fig season and there were no figs there. It seems like Jesus is kind of just being capricious. He's blaming a tree for not doing the thing that it couldn't do anyway. But there's something that you should know that'll help you understand this passage. It's that in April, the time these events would have happened, for a fig tree to be in leaf meant that it would have given off what were sort of seen as the early crop of figs. And that would have been edible for people that had them. So the fact that there weren't full-on figs is not a problem. There should have been something there for them to eat. And if there was nothing there now, there likely wouldn't be anything there later in the year as well. And if you think this is just Jesus being mean to a plant, just remember it's a plant, right? This is not a Pixar movie. This plant doesn't have feelings. This is just a plant. But it's not just about a plant, right? It's an applicable story for us. There's a very real possibility that your life and my life will look like this. That it'll look fruitful from far away, but nothing meaningful up close. Like a figless tree, we'll put out leaves that'll look vital to people who don't know us very well, but we'll fail to live out what we were made for as Christians. This use of fruit is a metaphor for spiritual vitality, is one of Jesus' favorite metaphors. He uses it in the parable of the soils when he talks about the different outcomes of seeds and the one that is fruitful, 30-fold, 60-fold, even 100-fold. He'll use it most famously probably in John 15 where he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me and you will bear much fruit, right? In the New Testament later on, some of the other authors will borrow this same metaphor of fruit. Probably most famously in Galatians 5, where Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit, the result of the Spirit's work showing itself in how we treat one another and our attitude before God. That to be growing in our faith is to be a fruitful person. So this is an applicable story for us because we look at the fig tree that Jesus is cursing and we say, is that me? Is that you? Am I living that sort of hypocritical life? And again, we can kind of wag our heads at the stories we see on the news and say, well, I'm not as bad as those people, right? I'm not the duplicitous congressman who acts like he's this man of faith, but secretly, is doing horrible things behind the scenes. Or I'm not the clergy person who's passing an offering plate before he gives a sermon, Bob. This is your problem, not my problem, right? Or I'm not the sort of person that's going to have terrible abuses of power or abuses at other people's expense. Those are macro cases of hypocrisy, and if you're doing those things, stop it. But there's also personal cases of hypocrisy. Right? Jesus talks about these as well. Being the sort of person who looks fruitful from afar but not up close. You only pray when there's other people around to hear. But if there's no one to hear you pray, what's the point? Right? If it's just God, why bother? Or when you are generous with others, you want other people to notice. You're the person who puts money in the tip jar, and if the person turns their back, you take it back out so you can put it in again, right? You pretend to have a different ethic around some people than others. Maybe you use different language, maybe you laugh at different jokes, but depending on who you're with, your values shift and change, and you say different things in different contexts. Because really, you're after the approval of people rather than having a fruit that comes out of a core. This is a challenge. This story is a challenge for all of us as individuals, but more than that, it's a challenge for a people. As Jesus originally enacts this parable, this fig tree, it wasn't just for all people at all times, though it was, but also for the nation of Israel in particular. And so he's going to go into the heart of their national place of gathering, the temple, and he's going to inspect the fig tree, metaphorically, for the fruit that he's seeking to find. Look at verse 15. They came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, and he began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So just a little bit of background here. Throughout the Old Testament, the temple is the primary place of Israel's offering of sacrifices. Now, if you go back very far before the time of Solomon, we have the tabernacle, and before that even we have altars and the Garden of Eden. But for most of what Jesus' generation would have known, the temple was the place of Israel's sacrificial life, the place of religious life, the sort of center of where they come. Now, when we think of temples, I think in our culture, we tend to think of cathedrals in Europe or in Turkey, sort of bigger versions of churches, right? Like whatever happened in a church happens in a cathedral in like just in a bigger sense. Temples weren't like that. They weren't bigger synagogues. They were unique. There was only the one temple of Israel. And so Jewish people from all over the world had to come to the temple certain times of the year in order to offer sacrifices. And one of those times is Passover week, the week where these events happen. And so as a result, Jewish people from all over the world who are faithful were coming back in order to offer their sacrifices. Now, could you bring a lamb with you all the way from the island of Cyprus, or all the way from Greece, or all the way from Asia Minor? You could. It's a long way to make a lamb walk, right? It's easier just to buy one when you get there. And so for generations, they had a marketplace outside of Jerusalem, actually on the Mount of Olives, where you could buy an animal, bring it to the temple, and offer your sacrifice there. Or if you had Roman coins, because you're part of the Roman system, you could exchange your Roman money for Jewish coins in order to pay the temple tax, or whatever else you needed to have for the temple. Is this a bad thing? Probably not in and of itself, but greed has this insidious way of the human heart, affecting the human heart, does it? And affecting worship. And so instead of that being in the Mount of Olives, where maybe the priestly class couldn't take a cut, or they couldn't supervise it most carefully, or where it wasn't convenient, they had moved this money-changing operation and this buying animals operation into the court of the Gentiles. Because who needs that? Just the Gentiles, and they're not important. And so they had moved it in there, and that was the place where they had bought and sold animals and coins. So that's the background. And Jesus goes in there, and I don't know how to put this gently. He starts a ruckus. And it's verse 17, it says, "And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers.'" A den of robbers. So what bothers Jesus? What does he say that bothers him so much about what they're doing? I mean, I noticed two things. Maybe you noticed more. He calls it a den of robbers. Now, we don't know exactly the exploitive way that the money changers were treating this, but he seems to have this idea that the people were taking advantage of their financial position to exploit, especially maybe the poorest members of Israel that were coming to offer sacrifices. The reason I say that is in verse 16, it says that he knocked over the stools of those who sold pigeons. The pigeon was the cheapest sacrifice you could offer in the Jewish system. It was the one allowance for those who had the least resources and still wanted to participate in the religious life. If you couldn't afford a lamb, at least you could afford a pigeon. Pigeons are very cheap, and at least you could still have something to offer to God. And it seems like those were the ones that were most taking advantage of their posture and that Jesus aimed his ire at most specifically. Secondly, he seems really bothered by the fact that this commerce had pushed out the Gentiles. One of the purposes of the temple was to be a light to the nations, a house of prayer for all nations to come and to know God. And Israel had decided that the Gentiles needed to be pushed out of their space in order to make things more convenient for them. A lot of people were expecting that when the Messiah would come, he would push out the foreigners. But instead, Jesus comes in to advocate for the foreigners, for Gentiles like me and probably like most of you. Instead of purging the temple from the Romans, he gets angry at Israel for not making space for the Romans to come and to pray to God. This is a big surprise for his generation, those people who are seeing what he's doing. I've wondered a lot this week, though. We talk about the cleansing of the temple in its sort of prophetic sense, right? That Jesus saw something that was wrong, and he said, stop it. Stop this religious hypocrisy. You needed to do something different. And I've wondered all week, what would have happened if Israel's leaders would have repented? What would have happened if they would have said, you're right, we should not do this is wrong. Let's look in the mirror and recognize the way that we're being exploitive and the way that we're losing our way and humbly repenting to God of what we've done. But they don't do that, right? In verse 18, it says, the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking for a way to destroy him, for they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. This is one of the really sad parts about religious hypocrisy, not just for people then, but for me, for you, for all of us now, is that we so often become blinded to it. We feel like we have to continue to hide. We have to continue to sort of protect ourselves. And even when that hypocrisy is exposed, our response is to lash out at other people rather than to humbly repent in response. This story isn't just a story, though, of one man who was angry at the temple. It was really an enactment of Jesus' role as the Messiah. A lot of commentators have noted that in the New Testament, Jesus fills three primary roles: the prophet, the priest, and the king. If you read the Old Testament, the prophet is the one who speaks on behalf of God and says, what you're doing is wrong, you need to stop it and repent. You can see how Jesus is the prophet here. He's the one who comes and tells them that what they're doing is wrong. But he's also the priest, right? He's the one who goes into the temple and says, I have the authority here to determine how worship should be conducted. And on top of that, he's the king, because the only person who could cleanse the temple throughout the Old Testament was the king of Israel. He fulfills all those three roles at once. He's the prophet, the priest, and the king, who goes into not just anywhere, but into the temple of God and says that this is the place made for worship of himself and his Father. It's really an amazing story of Jesus' role in salvation history. And he doesn't just object to the temple. He doesn't just say what you're doing is wrong, what you should do is different. In many ways, he ends the temple. It would just be a few days after this that the lambs and the pigeons and all the sacrifices that have been offered for generation and generation and generation would find their fulfillment in the sacrifice of Jesus' own life on the cross for us. The author of Hebrews points this out in Hebrews 10:12. It says, when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. The cleansing of the temple isn't just a rejection of religious hypocrisy. You and I could do that. We could say, this is wrong. But we couldn't do anything about it. Right? We couldn't change anything about it. Jesus' cleansing of the temple is pointing to the ultimate sacrifice he's going to offer for all of us and the point of the temple itself. Now, it hasn't escaped the notice of Christian theologians for generations that while Christians continued to attend the temple, we see in the book of Acts, in the years that followed Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, it would only be one generation before the temple would be destroyed. 2,000 years later, it's never been rebuilt. You can go to Jerusalem today and you can see the Western Wall, sometimes called the Wailing Wall, and on top of that, a Muslim mosque. And notice, and it makes you wonder, how in salvation history did God ordain this? That the temple would end right after Jesus rejected it, cleansed it, and replaced it with his own death on the cross for us. Well, you start thinking about these heady sort of historical things and we lose track of how to apply this to our life. So how should this event challenge us today? Well, first off, you may have heard the phrase or even used the phrase, goodness, I want to turn over tables in this place. Maybe you've been at a conference or you've been at an event or heaven forbid you've been here at Grace on a Sunday and you've seen something that looks like profiteering or looks like faith for profit or exploiting people for financial reasons. And you've had this sort of urge for God's glory and for justice to say, this is wrong. We should not do this. Okay, first of all, don't go assaulting people. But that desire for God's glory and to respect the poor, I think comes out of the very heart of Jesus. And I think there's something good and noble about wagging our heads at that. You ever hear the phrase, avoid like the plague? You got to avoid them like the plague. Do you know where that comes from, that quote, avoid like the plague? It comes from a 4th century theologian named St. Jerome. And do you know what the full context of the quote was? Avoid like the plague clergymen who become rich off their profession. Oh man. Now Jerome's not, he's not perfect, but I think there's some wisdom in that, right? All right, this is getting too convicting. I'm going to move on. But I also want to warn us against thinking the only people who might fall into this are pastors or religious leaders or political leaders or people different than us. I think there's also some challenge here that extends to all of us as Christians. And one of the things I want to point out is that he gets angry at the people who are buying and the people, not only the people who are selling, but the people who are buying as well. Look, let me find the specific verse. It says this. In verse 15, it says, he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought at the temple. Right? There's a responsibility on both sides of this transaction. And rather than just saying this is a problem for the leaders, I think there's a question for all of us of what do we do to contribute to this process as well? Do we treat our faith like a tool in order to profit off of? Sometimes using it as a tool to make deals with others, or maybe it's not financial at all. I mean, greed's not the only form of hypocrisy that's out there. There are ways that maybe we use religious language to try to gain influence with people. Maybe we pretend to be more spiritual than we are in order to gain our parents' affection or approval, or to make our spouse think well of us. Like we don't have any fruit that's coming out of it, but we kind of use our faith to curry favor with other people. Right? That I think there's a conviction, a healthy conviction and challenge that should come out of this passage for all of us. All right. We're running short on time, but I do want to make one last point here in verse 20. I said it was a bracket. We're going to get to the last part of the bracket here, where the next day they come and they find the fig tree dead. Now, this is Jesus' only destructive miracle we know of. Usually Jesus is doing things that are constructive, or he's making something. This is the only time we see him kill something. And it's just a plant, so don't freak out. But it says in verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered to its roots. And Peter remembered, and he said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Now, I think we're tempted to read that and say, and sort of intonate it as Peter saying, like, it worked. I can't believe that worked. That's amazing. I've tried to kill fig trees before. I can't believe you did it. That's so cool. Like, that's kind of our wonder translation. I think Peter's tone would have been a little different. Given the role of the fig tree in the mythology and the self-identity of Israel, I think it'd be more like, you see the sickly bald eagle, and the next day you come and find the dead bald eagle. Right after Jesus has just gone through the Capitol building and said, you're all corrupt, get out of here. Wouldn't you as an American think, oh, that's it for our country, right? Like, look, it's dead, right? We're dead, we are in trouble. This is the end of it. I think that tone makes better sense of what Jesus says afterwards when he says in verse 22, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it'll be done for him. Jesus is going to go on to give this amazing description of prayer that deserves time that we can't give it this morning. But I think that the background of why he talks about it now is the hopelessness that is tempted to be there in the face of religious hypocrisy. And the reason I bring this up is because I talk to so many young adults especially, but people of all ages, that look at the religious hypocrisy of our generation, whether it's the clergy sex abuse crisis of the last 50 years, whether it's the politicization of a lot of Christians in the news, whether it's the way that Christians don't live lives in our own personal experience that we think they should live, or it's our own hypocrisy that we see in our own hearts, our own inability to deal with besetting sins. And we just kind of throw up our hands and say, what hope is there? What hope is there? What hope is there for me? Maybe it's not real. Maybe it's not true. And I think that Jesus' words to Peter are his words to us in the midst of that feeling of deconstruction, of saying, have faith in God. Right? Don't put your faith in religious leaders. Don't put your faith in what you can see. Don't even put your faith in your own will. Have faith in God. And in light of that, it is such a rich time to come to communion today. Because we come as a people who are more like the fruitless fig tree than we'd care to admit. We're more like the religious hypocrites of Jesus' generation than we'd care to admit. And we come not as people who have so much to show to God that we deserve, but rather as empty fig trees who say, Christ, I need you. Lord, have mercy. And we come to the communion table not with much to brag about, but much to confess of. And we turn to him not with a lot of bravado, but with deep wells of humility, saying, Christ, would you forgive me? So a couple things as we come to communion together here and sing one last song and close. I hope you come with a place of recognizing Jesus was not a hypocrite. That Jesus himself, even if you feel discouraged by the world around you, is the one who has done what he said he would do. And yet he was judged, he was rejected by men, and he has died the death that you and I deserve. So the proper response is humble confession and repentance and our recognition of need for forgiveness. And then an invitation to Christ to work in and through us that which is pleasing to him. Let's close in prayer. God, we look at this story of the fig tree and the story of Jesus' cleansing of the temple, and we are humbled because we see ourselves too often in the light of the people who have much to be forgiven of. God, but we also look at the story and we see the goodness of Jesus Christ. We see the goodness of his anger and his justice, and we see the goodness of his gift of his death on the cross for us. God, I pray for my friends who are here, who feel like they have so many questions for you about why you allow hypocrisy in the world and why you've allowed terrible things to happen. God, I pray that as they look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, they would find someone that they can trust and have faith in. It's in his name we pray. Amen.